It was supposed to be a routine flight from Paris to Ouagadougou. But somewhere at 30,000 feet, a simple act of disrespect turned a quiet journey into a global wake-up call. He wasn't wearing a suit. No security detail. No loud conversations. Just a man in seat 14A, quiet, reading a book. Few would have guessed he was Ibrahim Traoré, the President of Burkina Faso. The cabin crew moved about as usual. But one attendant, French, mid-30s professional, seemed visibly irritated by this quiet passenger. First, she ignored his request for water. Then, she snapped when he politely asked for a blanket. "Sir, I've already told you. That's not my job. If you need anything, ask someone else." Passengers nearby exchanged looks. Some were uncomfortable. A few were clearly annoyed. But Traoré didn't react. He just nodded quietly and turned back to his book. Honestly, I thought he was just a calm, regular guy. But you could tell, he was being treated differently. It didn't sit right with some of us. It was only after landing that the curtain was pulled back. As passengers disembarked, local officials and military officers were seen waiting by the tarmac. Not for the CEO, not for the diplomats, but for the man from seat 14A. The flight attendant's eyes widened as she watched the quiet passenger walk straight into a waiting escort. National Guards snapping to attention. Ibrahim Traoré had flown economy class. Without announcement, without special treatment, and he had watched silently as the very values he fights for, dignity, equality, respect, were tested right in front of him. What made this moment so powerful wasn't just the disrespect, it was the restraint. President Traoré never raised his voice, never pulled rank. And yet, when the truth came out, everyone in that cabin saw the strength of humility, the dignity of silence. One flight, one moment, one lesson. Never judge the power of a person by the seat they're sitting in. As President Traoré stepped off the plane, calm and composed, the atmosphere on the tarmac shifted. But inside the cabin, the shock hadn't fully sunk in, especially for one man, Henri Delacroix, CEO of a major French mining corporation. Delacroix had just spent 8 hours flying beside a man he believed to be just another traveler. In his mind, the important meeting he was flying in for, with Burkina Faso's government, was still days away. But now, he realized something else. He had been sitting 2 rows behind the very man he came to impress. Earlier during the flight, Delacroix had made casual conversation with another European passenger about African politics, even joking about how leaders in some countries just come and go. He had no idea that one of Africa's youngest and most talked about leaders was quietly listening a few rows ahead. The restraint was remarkable. Traoré didn't interrupt, didn't correct, didn't reveal his identity. He simply observed. The flight attendant, whose dismissive tone had gone unnoticed by most of the crew, suddenly looked pale. She watched the National Guards stand to attention. Her voice, which had carried loudly through the cabin hours ago, was now silent. She asked a colleague, "That's the president?" The other just nodded. She looked like she wanted to disappear. This wasn't the first time President Traoré had moved quietly. Known for rejecting luxury and operating close to the ground, he had earned the respect of many in Burkina Faso for being hands-on, relatable, and unshaken by formalities. Power should not be used to elevate, but to serve. If people only respect you when they know your title, they never really respected you at all. For Delacroix, the incident was more than awkward. It was a reminder. Influence doesn't always wear a badge or sit in first class. And for the flight attendant, it was a lesson in professionalism. That respect should never be reserved only for the visibly powerful. What had started as just another flight ended with 2 very different realizations. One for a man who thought he understood power, and another for a woman who learned that dignity isn't something you see, it's something you give. By the time the passengers had cleared the terminal, the flight crew was no longer talking about turbulence or landing time. All attention was on one thing, the man they had underestimated. The flight attendant who had dismissed President Ibrahim Traoré earlier was silent. Her confidence had turned to confusion. She wasn't afraid of punishment, she was embarrassed. She had treated a head of state like he didn't matter. And now the whole cabin crew knew it. "You should probably write something. Maybe send it through the airline. This is big," one of the crew members whispered to her. But President Traoré hadn't filed a complaint. No official statement. No drama. Just silence. A silence that said more than a press conference ever could. Meanwhile, Henri Delacroix was already thinking ahead. He had a meeting with the Burkinabe government in 2 days. Now, it was clear he'd be sitting across the very man he had overlooked. For a man used to being the most powerful person in the room, Delacroix was learning fast that in Africa, power often comes without the noise. Word of the in-flight moment started to leak into local media circles, not as official news, but through whispers and anonymous tips. A few blogs picked it up. President Traoré flies economy again. This time, a French CEO and crew are left stunned. This isn't about embarrassment. It's about respect, a local journalist explained. The president keeps proving he is a man of the people, and the world is noticing. Eventually, the flight attendant did write something. Not to save her job, but to try and make it right. A message was sent to the Burkinabe embassy in Paris, a simple apology. No excuses, just recognition of a mistake. To His Excellency President Traoré, I offer my sincere apologies for my conduct during Flight 422. I now understand who you are, but more importantly, I understand what I failed to see, your humanity. Whether he read the message or not, no one knows. But those close to him say he likely did, and he likely forgave. Because for President Traoré, power isn't about being served. It's about how you respond when you're not. The lesson had been delivered, not through confrontation, but through character. And for everyone who watched it unfold, the flight was over, but the reflection had just begun. 2 days later, the meeting room inside the government complex in Ouagadougou was quiet but tense. Officials from Burkina Faso sat on one side of the long table. On the other, Henri Delacroix, suited, rehearsed, but clearly not as composed as usual. When the doors opened and President Ibrahim Traoré walked in, there was a shift in the air. He wore no extravagant uniform, just a clean, traditional kaftan, calm, grounded, and without ceremony. Delacroix stood, unsure if he should offer a handshake or wait. The president approached, nodded once, and took his seat at the head of the table. "Let's begin," Traoré said simply. What followed was a business meeting like any other: budgets, cooperation agreements, proposals for investment. But beneath every word, Delacroix could feel it, the weight of recent events still hanging silently in the room. He chose his words carefully. Gone was the usual corporate charm. In its place, a respectful tone, thoughtful pauses, and something new: humility. "I believe there is much we can do together," Delacroix said, "if we listen more and assume less." There was a pause. Traoré looked at him for a long moment before responding. "Assumptions can be costly," he said, "but lessons, when learned well, often bring value." Delacroix nodded, his face slightly flushed. He knew exactly what the president meant. Outside, the press waited, unaware of the tension that had filled the room earlier that week. The headlines the next day would focus on partnerships and trade. But inside the corridors of power, the conversation had already moved beyond policy. Later that evening, as President Traoré visited a local vocational training center for youth, one of his aides quietly mentioned that the French executive had personally followed up with a note of appreciation. He didn't respond. He simply watched a young girl hammering together a wooden frame, her hands steady with purpose. That, to him, was the real work. Back in Paris, Delacroix sat alone in his office, staring at the small piece of Burkina Faso fabric he had received as a diplomatic gift. Simple, unbranded, hand-woven. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about deals or deadlines. He was thinking about dignity, about how easily it's missed when you expect power to wear a suit, speak in titles, and walk through VIP doors. This trip had changed something, and not because of what was said in the meeting, but because of what wasn't. Respect had been given, not demanded, and that difference, though quiet, was powerful enough to echo far beyond a single flight or boardroom. Weeks passed, but the memory of that flight lingered in quiet conversations, not just within the airline, but in diplomatic circles, business lounges, and newsrooms across West Africa and Europe. Inside the airline's internal review team, the story had become a case study. Not because it caused a scandal, it didn't. There was no viral video, no trending hashtag, no international fallout. But precisely because of that, it held weight. It was discussed in terms of behavior, perception, and missed cues. How could someone overlook the presence of a national leader? How could a uniform or soft-spoken tone lead to such misjudgment? One senior manager finally said it plainly. This wasn't about protocol. It was about bias. Unconscious but real. The flight attendant involved had requested a transfer, not out of punishment, but personal reflection. She didn't want to work in the same pattern anymore. She had started taking language classes, reading more about African cultures, history, and leadership styles. Privately, she said, "I don't want to just serve passengers. I want to understand them." Meanwhile, President Traoré remained silent publicly. No interview, no mention of the event. But those close to him noticed a change in his schedule. More unannounced flights. More visits to rural towns. Sometimes, he flew commercial when there were private options available. "He wants to stay grounded," his aide whispered once. "He says people treat you differently when they think you're someone, so it's good to remind yourself how they act when they don't know." That attitude began to spread. Among younger leaders in Burkina Faso, a quiet pride grew. Not just because their president had been disrespected, but because he hadn't reacted with anger or revenge. One university student put it simply, "We are taught that strength is loud, but his silence taught us that true strength doesn't need to raise its voice." Back in France, Delacroix had followed through on his promise. His company launched a youth internship program in Burkina Faso, small at first, but real. For once, the initiative wasn't just about profit or optics. It was about building something that lasted. And although he never said it publicly, he had a framed quote in his office from that trip. "Assumptions can be costly, but lessons, when learned well, often bring value." As for the world beyond, the moment didn't make global headlines. But for everyone who was there, from the embarrassed flight attendant to the surprised CEO, to the passengers who watched silently from their seats, something had shifted. Not in politics, not in policy, but in perception. And that sometimes is where the most powerful change begins. Months later, in a small community outside Bobo de Lasso, President Traoré arrived unannounced at a local school. There was no motorcade, no media. Just him, a few aides, and the sound of children learning under trees because the classrooms were full. He walked slowly, nodding at teachers, asking quiet questions about supplies, about food, about electricity. A young boy looked up from his wooden desk and whispered, "Is that the president?" Another replied, "No, the president flies in jets." Traoré heard them and smiled. He spent the rest of the day listening. Not speaking, not instructing, listening. A teacher handed him a notebook filled with student essays. He took it, flipped through the pages carefully, and tucked it under his arm as if it were a state document. Back in the capital, people had started to notice the small shifts. Fewer public speeches, more quiet action. His decisions were bolder, more focused on rural infrastructure, youth jobs, and transparency. But still, no personal spotlight. Yet the story of that flight kept resurfacing. In a regional leadership summit in Accra, a Ghanaian minister mentioned it casually over lunch. They say Traoré was treated like a nobody at 30,000 feet. He didn't say a word, just landed, stood tall, and let the truth speak for itself. Another diplomat added, "We need more of that. Not just in how we carry power, but how we recognize it." Traoré's way of leading had begun to inspire a quiet wave across West Africa. Young politicians started rethinking how they dressed, how they traveled, how they spoke to their people. One even said in an interview, "Traoré taught me that leadership isn't what you say on a podium. It's how you act when no one's watching, and how you treat people when they think you're no one." Meanwhile, the airline had changed its crew training materials. Not because of policy, but because of culture. A new section was added under Human Dignity in the Sky. It didn't mention any names, but the message was clear. In Paris, Delacroix attended a quiet meeting with African startup founders. He listened more than he spoke. When asked what had shifted his mindset, he paused before answering. "I met someone on a flight who reminded me that real power doesn't need a spotlight, and real leaders don't have to announce themselves to be respected." By then, the flight was long past. No cameras had captured the moment. No viral clips existed. But those who were there, they remembered. Because it wasn't about the plane. It was about how quickly people judge when they think someone is beneath them, and how deeply they reflect when they realize they were wrong. The school notebook sat on the corner of President Traoré's desk for weeks. Tattered at the edges, filled with blue ink essays and spelling tests. It seemed out of place next to government memos and classified reports. But every few days, he'd flip it open and read a few pages, quietly smiling at the handwriting, the ideas, the ambition inside. One afternoon, he called in his education advisor. "We need more desks," he said simply, "but also more imagination. These children are thinking bigger than we are." That same week, funding was approved for a literacy program that prioritized creative writing and local storytelling. The team didn't publicize it much. There was no ribbon cutting, no speech. Just results. In a remote part of Burkina Faso, a young girl wrote a short story about a traveler on a plane who people ignored, only to find out later he was a king. Her teacher posted it on a local education blog. A journalist picked it up and made a quiet connection. The story, though fictional, echoed the real event. Did she know? The journalist asked the teacher. She knows what dignity looks like, the teacher replied. Even if no one tells her, she sees it. Back in Europe, the airline's training supervisor visited a West African branch office for the first time. She requested to meet local ground staff and cabin crew, not just managers. During the lunch break, she sat with a young Burkinabe employee who nervously asked, "Is it true what happened with the president?" She nodded. "Yes, and it taught us something we couldn't learn from books." "What was that?" he asked. "That respect isn't about status. It's about presence, about being human before being anything else." In the corporate world, Delacroix was beginning to take more personal steps. He declined an exclusive invite to speak at a major business forum in London, sending instead a young engineer from Burkina Faso who had led the company's latest project there. People were surprised. "She's the one who did the real work," he said. By then, the story had moved on for most people. But those who had felt it firsthand, the flight attendant, the CEO, the crew, the quiet passengers who witnessed it all, carried it with them like a compass. It became a private reminder. Never underestimate the quiet one. Never dismiss the ordinary moment. And always remember that true authority doesn't shout. It listens, waits, and speaks only when needed. In a world loud with status and image, the story of Ibrahim Traoré on that silent flight whispered something far more powerful. A lesson that didn't need cameras to be real or applause to be remembered. A year later, a quiet ceremony was held in Ouagadougou to honor individuals who had made meaningful contributions to dignity and humility in public service. It wasn't a flashy event. No international media. No red carpet. Just a small room, a few wooden chairs, and handwritten certificates on recycled paper. President Traoré arrived late, dressed simply, no grand entrance. He shook hands with every attendee and sat at the back. When it was his turn to speak, he walked up slowly, paused, then said just one thing. "Never forget that how we treat people when we think they're nobody says everything about who we really are." Then he stepped back. Among the attendees was the former flight attendant. She wasn't there as a guest of honor, just part of a delegation on hospitality training. But someone had told her he might be attending. When their eyes met, she stood instinctively. He walked over, extended his hand, and nodded. No words were exchanged. But in that moment, there was no tension. Only recognition. Not of status, but of growth. Later that evening, she wrote in her journal, "The man I once overlooked didn't just teach me a lesson. He gave me a chance to become better." Not everyone gets that. Outside the hall, a group of university students were talking about leadership, responsibility, and what it really means to represent your people. They hadn't lived through coups or cold wars. They didn't speak in the language of revolutions, but they were hungry for authenticity. One of them said, "The world looks for big gestures, but real change, it often starts with small things. A look, a seat on a plane, a silence that speaks louder than anger." In the months that followed, more African leaders began embracing quieter diplomacy. Fewer processions, more presence, not to copy Traoré, but to echo the shift his actions had symbolized. And while the story of that flight never became viral, it became something deeper. It became a reference in lectures, a case study in leadership workshops, a whispered tale told from one generation to the next about what it truly means to lead, not with title, but with character. No headlines, no breaking news, just a man on a flight, and a world that watched, learned, and changed, one quiet lesson at a time. Thank you for watching. Kindly like, comment, subscribe, and share for more videos like this.